Hi, everybody, and welcome to the fourth ever virtual bash. So I'm Garth Gilmour, your concierge, and on this occasion, the third speaker. So a very warm welcome to everybody. So just a few announcements before we get started. So the August bash has a working title of the Polymath Bash. So we'll be exploring how having other hobbies or talents or side jobs and so on can contribute to your success as a developer. So for example, we'll be talking about people who get a lot of value out of creative writing and so on, but it won't be exclusively limited to that. And then our bash membership has now gone well past 2,000. So a special mention to all our new members. You're very, very welcome indeed. But unlike the high street banks, we would assure you that we love everybody equally. Okay, so everybody gets a cookie and all the cookies are of the same size. Yeah, although C# developers do get the ones with raisins. I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. Yeah. And then as ever, if you would like to present, if you have an idea for a bash theme or anything like that, please let us know. I mean, it is a community-driven event after all. And finally, thank you so much for attending. We have well over 100 signed up for an event in July in Northern Ireland, and that's remarkable. So thank you so much for attending. So on with the show. As you know, this is the Craft Bash, and we're discussing software as a craft. So we have two great talks, plus one from me. So without further ado, I would like to summon Kevlin if he would like to share his screen and turn on his audio.
Right, there we go. Can you
Here we are.
Hear me? We all good?
Very good. And I believe that you unfortunately have a hard stop at 1.
Pretty much. So everything that needs to be said, Q&As and all the rest of it.
Yes, we will do a longer Q&A after your talk. Yeah. So so please keep the questions flowing, and I will ask them on your behalf. Always love that phrase, by the way. The first time I was in a meeting with an American client, and they came on and they said, I've got a hard stop at 3 o'clock. And I was like, well, thank you for sharing. That sounds very painful. Is there no medication or creams that you can take to help you in this endeavor? But you know, never mind. Anyway, I shall leave you to it.
Right, excellent. Okay, so let's do a quick screen share. And aha. So Garth, you're going to have to come back, mate. Host disabled participant screen sharing.
Whoops, we can sort that out right now.
We were doing so well with the setup. We were doing
so well. Everything seemed so professional. So I think our master of ceremonies. Yes, we good? Excellent.
Excellent. Thank you. Perfect. Right. Okay. Right. So I'm going to decloak because I don't have to listen to anybody at this point. And honestly, you spend these days, I think we're spending far too long with headphones on. And really what I want to talk about is a bit more of the human side. I think it's... in the other talks, there's a number of other aspects that are going to be brought out that are people normally associate with craft. But I think that there has been a bit of a dissociation sometimes with the, I guess, the more human side of things. And what I want to explore in this talk is the passions of programming. And really, it's to do with this word passion. And it's a difficult word. It's a tricky word. And I want to explore it a little bit and then explore the idea that actually maybe there's more than one, that we have many kinds of passions that we need to express. And I'm going to look at basically passion, dispassion, and compassion. And these I'm going to put forward as the passions of programming. And what we're looking for is a balance here. So this is a much abused word these days. People keep talking about passion and passionate developers. This is, so I did this, thorough research by LinkedIn last year. I thought, let's just look up amongst the job ads, passionate software developer. So apparently, passionate software developer in the United Kingdom, nearly 6,000 results. We want talented individuals who are passionate. Are you passionate? Be passionate. Wow, this is getting quite imperative. And then if you want kind of like a parade of buzzwords, passionate and driven, it is not merely enough to be passionate. You have to be driven. Full stack, there we go, web developer. It's possibly the only words in that sentence that are at all useful are looking for a web developer. That's it. I spoke at a conference last year, Voxed at CERN. So that was one off the bucket list to go to CERN. And there I was asked to submit my passion. So this is all getting very, very intimate, and it does raise a number of questions. What do I mean by this thing? We keep using this word. Is it the right word? Does it have a unique meaning? Well, I'm going to suggest perhaps it doesn't. I mean, we're not really totally in the business of making babies when we're coming out with new software, although, you know, it's a metaphor, my baby. But okay, first of all, it's a noun, it's a thing. What does it actually mean? Well, its original meaning is suffering. Now, this one, I think a lot of developers can relate to. This is, you know, gives us phrases like the passion of Christ and all the rest of it. It is to do with suffering. That is its original meaning, which gives rise to this idea of something that is intense, this idea of enthusiasm. Perhaps that's what we're harnessing. When we talk about, you know, oh, you know, if you're going to be into craft, then, you know, if you want to really pursue your software profession, then you need passion. You need an intense enthusiasm. Problem is that we also associate passion with other words. Strong and barely controllable. Is that what we want in the office? Is this good? And perhaps this is probably a step too far for most development environments. I would suggest that is the case. So the word passion is an interesting one because it's clearly strongly emotional, and it smacks of intensity. In fact, it even gets its own color. It's one of the few emotions that actually gets its own color. We associate red with passion. Red gets a lot of associations here, but red is also the color of stop, it's the color of fail, and it's the color of love, the color of blood, the color of war and the planet of war. And so there's a lot of kind of like intensity here. Maybe we need to kind of find a way through this to dial this down, because obviously we do want people to be interested, but there is a danger that we start excluding people by saying that they are not passionate. We say, oh, that developer's not passionate. And unfortunately, this also starts equating, and something I'm going to come back to a little bit later, this starts equating to the way that people are evaluated. So for example, you might, you know, to describe a developer who does not stay late, does not do overtime, all the rest of it, you know, they're not passionate because they go home on time. They're not passionate because they have other things in their life. They're not passionate because they weren't developing from the age of 11 or 12 and this kind of stuff. I think it's hugely exclusionary. It makes massive assumptions about what is good, but it also glosses over certain dysfunctionality. So war, aggression, all the rest of it, we seem to be living in a particular time where this is surprisingly popular, and we kind of have the kind of aggression of the kind of fascist contingent and others. I'm not saying that's necessarily spills over into the workplace, but I think this episode a couple of years back in Birmingham was a perfect example of sometimes a calmness confronting compassion. This on the left is Sophia Khan, on the right is some nutter from the EDL, and she just smiled at him. This photo went viral, although I'm cautious about using that word these days. And the quote that she gave the papers was, sometimes it's more important to smile than to shout. Sometimes we need to dial down on that passion. Sometimes that's not helping us. Sometimes it is causing us arguments or exclusion. So perhaps we need a little bit more of this. Dispassion. To be dispassionate about something, an absence of passion. Perhaps what we're after here is certain coolness, being emotionally uninvolved, detachment. And this is important. This is an important quality as well, because this idea of detachment and objectivity is important for us, particularly when we're dealing with code and things that we create. When you are creating code, there is if we take it as a purely passionate thing, that might drive you, get you into something. It might help you through it. It might drive you might be driven by your curiosity and the desire to learn. These are all good things. But what we may also find is that if that doesn't quite work out, or if you do a code review and the code review does not go well, if you don't have that dispassionate quality, you will associate, not that the code is being critiqued, you will associate that with you. You come to identify with the things that you create. It's also why people find it very difficult to get rid of code that they've invested a lot of time and effort in. There's always that idea of like, well, there's a new framework, we could replace this. And it's just like, yeah, but there's this thing called the endowment effect. We have invested ourselves in creating something. It's very difficult to let that go. So detachment is something we're after, this idea of objectivity. Now, the downside here is that this is what the word means. It's a freedom from passion. And notice the word freedom there, but it's freedom from bias and emotion. And that all comes across as very Spock and very logical, and that's great. But we have a little bit of a conflict here. Is that really human? Are we actually that logical? Are we asking of ourselves too much? So we see already, just by introducing passion and dispassion, we've already realized that there's a whole spectrum of things that we're interested in, that we find good, but also that we find problematic. And some of those are problematic because they just don't fit the way that people are. So there's this question about what drives us. So a number of years ago, I edited this book, 97 Things Every Programmer Should Know. And just, book plug. I edited this book with Trisha G, 97 Things Every Java Programmer Should Know, that came out a couple of months ago. So that's a kind of a lockdown book that came out, and finalized in the editing over lockdown. But in the preface of 97 Things Every Programmer Should Know, I made this observation of trying to deal with this idea that we're always dealing with a kind of contradiction. There's an art, craft, and science to programming that extends far beyond the program. The act of programming marries the discrete world of computers with the fluid world of human affairs. Programmers mediate between the negotiated and uncertain truths of business and the crisp, uncompromising domain of bits and bytes and higher constructed types. What we have here is a challenge. One of the reasons that software development is both exciting and hard is that it is not about one or the other, it is about both. If you are anchored in the world of business, that gives you a particular worldview. And that is very much this idea of this fluid idea. And truths are negotiable. This is not a domain of rigorous maths and science that we can point to objectively and rationally. And indeed, much business is definitely not about that. And then we hit the code. And there's no negotiating with the compiler, and perhaps you've tried. Well, people don't negotiate with compilers. Compilers don't take prisoners. They will tell you that this does not compile. A test will tell you that this does not pass. And although at that point we get passionate, we get emotional, particularly if we've invested a lot of time in this, and we might say things to the compiler. Turns out the compiler's not listening. The problem here is not just that domain, which is a determined domain. It is strictly specified. A program is a tight specification of what we want constructed, but a business is not. A group of people doesn't work like that. That's what makes software development so, as I say, challenging and exciting and interesting. It is because it is bridging both of these worlds. And we see that no matter how careful and objective we try to be, or impersonal, and that's the problem, is being impersonal is a difficulty. We will end up, our humanity will somehow bleed through and come through. So here is the Clue Train Manifesto was kind of a big deal at the end of the 1990s. It was originally published online. Basically, it was a number of points against business as usual. It was mostly about business to business. I mean, it was a manifesto about business to business online. And of all the things that have had a manifesto, that is possibly one of the most interesting, because why would you get excited about this? And yet it was incredibly well written. There was a book version published, which I was quite taken with. There was a lot of really good stuff in there. But there's this lovely observation, which I think captures a lot of how people might be motivated, and deals with this kind of curious marriage between the logical and the rational, and the idea of dispassion, and yet the idea of creating business, which is ultimately a collaborative affair and a highly human affair. And this idea of creativity, which it's not necessarily at odds with rationality, but we often associate creativity with passion. And you see we're wrestling with these contradictions. And the observation made is people in high tech take pride in their work. So pride is a distinctly human emotion. Clearly, too much of it is not a good thing, but there is this idea of signing your name. This kind of came out in the pragmatic program all those years ago. Just sign your work. You'd be proud of it. But that is definitely a passion thing. They are individuals who see the details of the things they produce in the light of the trials and triumphs they experience while creating products. This is all about the human condition. In the courage of creation, they find a place to hang their individuality. Programmers and technotypes appreciate elegant, spare code and the occasional well-turned architectural hack. For me, that nails it. That's absolutely, there's a wonderful truth to this. And it also highlights this challenge that we have. We are, on the one hand, trying to be rational, objective. We are working with the tools of logic, and we are dealing with these crisp concepts. And yet at the same time, we are human, and we work with other people, and there's all of these other things. So it's this trying to find this balance. And yet we realize the excess in any particular direction of all of these is going to be a problem. And stepping back from the logical and rational, there is a simple idea. So Garth mentioned kind of creative writing as being the theme for next month's bash. I write short fiction, flash fiction, mostly. And curiously enough, I haven't done much over lockdown, but I've been doing a little bit, and I quite like this idea as an outlet. I find that it does help me kind of look at things from another point of view. But I also am fascinated when you work in another domain, looking back on something like software development. You see certain things. It's always interesting. You get a better sense of something by looking at it from somewhere else. And you see things that are similar. You see things that are in parallel. And one of the things that I notice as we talk about craft and software, in writing, people talk about craft. But what I find interesting is one of the few disciplines where they don't call it the craft of writing. They call it the craft. It's one of the few disciplines where they actually just call it the craft. You get to add the craft. Whoa. It's a very specific term in that sense. But there are contrasts. There are huge contrasts. One side we see the creativity, but on another side we see that writing is more likely done individually than collaboratively, whereas software development is intrinsically a socio-technical construct. It is rarer although individuals may develop small pieces of code or may start something, ultimately what gets created is created with others. And we might say the production team of a book is associated with that, but actually everybody has highly specialized roles. These are quite different. So writing is more usually done with an individual author, whereas software is not. We also find other aspects of a gender balance. For example, when I go to writing things, I'm in, as a male, I'm in a minority. And I think that's a very healthy perspective for a lot of software developers. Could probably learn a lot from that. It's a mirror world in some cases, but in other cases, it taps into something that is common to all of us across many domains. And this observation in Robert McKee's story is lovely. If a plot works out exactly as you first planned, you're not working loosely enough to give room to your imagination and instincts. I think this is a lovely way of looking at this, because it also tells us if we are purely logical about things, we need to accept that we are working with incomplete knowledge, that we are always in software development, you are working to create something that does not currently exist in the world. It might be a variation of something that already exists, but it's not manufacturing. Manufacturing is the creation of identical artifacts, whereas in software, we are looking to introduce variation. Now, that is the value add. So therefore, there is always an unknown. By definition, you're always working with incomplete knowledge. And there is almost, and not that we have too much of a problem with this, delivering everything on time, according exactly to plan. But there is this idea, if we did deliver according to plan, there's almost a disappointment. It basically means perhaps we didn't learn something. Everything went exactly as we thought it would. We had everything, we knew everything in advance. We have learnt almost nothing. And that might actually be considered a disappointment. So this idea of unbuttoning a little bit, loosening, just taking it down a level, to let some of those instincts and let some of that perhaps passion through, but not in that destructive sense that we highlighted earlier. There is actually a kind of term for this. I run a page on Facebook, languages. It's on language and words, and occasionally I will feature a word on a Friday, hence the name Word Friday. A few years ago, I featured one from the creative writing community. The term is pantser, and it's nothing to do. It's nothing to do with tanks or panthers or anything like that. A writer who writes by the seat of their pants, and this is in contrast to a plotter, and we can see these extremes in software development as well. You have people who, and so these are not either or options. Again, we are introducing continua. I think we like the simple answers. We like the true, false. We like to be one thing or another. You need to be passionate or you need to be dispassionate. I've seen lightning talks which claim that we need to be one or the other, and they set one up in contradiction to the other. But the human condition is much more complex. There's a spectrum here. There's a range. And in truth, there's a range between we have no idea what we're doing, well, let's just see what happens. Let's everything become purely emergent. And between that and we have everything, all the details worked out in advance, and we're going to waterfall this. And we will find that different people, different projects, different teams, and so on, fall into that range, and we're constantly wrestling with what feels like a contradiction but should be acknowledged as being natural. I think my favorite quote about panthers, though, came from American author Louis L'Amour. He said, one day I was speeding along at the typewriter, and my daughter, who was a child at the time, asked me, "Daddy, why are you writing so fast?" And I replied, "Because I want to see how the story turns out." And that kind of characterizes the pantser style, as opposed to you have a detailed plan of everything that's going to happen in every chapter, and you have a breakdown of all the characters in advance. So there's this whole thing here about us and logic. And I think a lot of developers assume that they are quite logical. I mean, you know, this is a fairly standard thing. We always think that our profession is in some way exceptional compared to others. And in software development, because we work with the stuff of logic, you know, you go into a programming language and you have types that are named after this chap here, George Bull. We have Boolean logic, a formalized propositional calculus, and in that typically Victorian way, characterizes as the laws of thought. The full Victorian title is a little bit longer, as you can see. But the laws of thought. In the 19th century, there was this belief that humankind was intrinsically logical, and that it is only society that makes things messy, and that therefore we must kind of peel back these layers of obfuscation and reveal the true human. It's a very Platonic ideal. And that everything would be solvable. You know, maths would be solved. We'd be done with physics by the end of the 19th century. Anyway, 1900s kind of demonstrated that no, that's not going to work out. You know, there are boundaries to what can be claimed as knowable. This happened in physics. This happens in maths. But also this interesting illusion about how we think and how we believe other our artifacts will work for us, and this idea that, oh well, if we are working with logic, we must be logical. I kind of always like this quote from Charles Babbage. On 2 occasions I have been asked, "Pray, Mr. Babbage, if you put into the machine wrong figures, will the right answers come out? I am not able rightly to apprehend the kind of confusion of ideas that could provoke such a question." I think it's a lovely piece of 19th century English, but it also captures the original garbage in, garbage out observation. And we are not immune from failures in logic. It's intrinsically bound up with us. And indeed, if you look around at developers, I will say that my first degree was in physics. I will say that software developers are way less logical than scientists by my experience. And yes, I'm excluding computer science as a science in this conversation. They are way less logical. And honestly, some writers who would consider themselves to be artsy and illogical and irrational, I would say actually have a better purchase on logic. Perhaps it's because we're a little bit blind to it, that we don't see our own illogic about how we work and the ways that we judge things, and the way that we interview and recruit other people. This all kind of fits together. But that blind spot is huge. We are not good at logic. We miss things. We are not complete, and we are easily misled. So I showed a picture of Mars earlier on. Mars, the Roman god of war, gave us the name for March. Roman gods generally gave us names for many of our months. But also, it was the site of a bit of a screw up. Mars has eaten so many probes. There's some really interesting stats on this. Mars just devours. It devours probes, whether they're going as orbiter missions or lander missions. And indeed, in what may have been an astonishing piece of foresight many years ago, the British probe Beagle 2 decided to, was delivered to Mars using the European Space Agency vehicle, and the European Space Agency vehicle went into orbit, and Britain decided to go its own way, and basically it was a failed mission. So I don't know what I'm drawing a parallel with therefore, but I'll leave that to the viewer. But let's talk about something more recent. Okay, so about 4 years ago, the Schiaparelli probe was thrown at Mars, and the orbiter went fine, but the mission to the surface did not work out quite so well. Schiaparelli's IMU, the inertial measurement unit, went about its business of calculating the lander's rotation rate. For some reason, the IMU calculated a saturation maximum period that persisted for 1 second longer than what would normally be expected at this stage. What does that mean in practice? Well, what it means in practice is that when the IMU sent this bogus info to the craft's navigation system, it calculated a negative altitude. That means you are below ground. And what is great, one of the things I love about the European Space Agency is that they will publish all of their inquiries publicly, so you can go and look at this stuff. And this is just personal interest. So the ExoMars mission, of which the Schiaparelli probe was part of. Also, by the way, notice the beautifully euphemistic language that is used in space travel. Schiaparelli anomaly inquiry. Next time you're having a really bad day, servers are crashing, code is doing who knows what, feel free to just inject the word anomaly. You know, just don't describe it using hyperbolic terms. Use really underrated terms and euphemistic terms. It's an anomaly. So what actually happened? Because of the error in the estimated attitude that occurred at parachute inflation, so basically what happened is, as you can imagine, entering a planet's atmosphere, there's going to be a bit of wobbling. It's not a smooth and gentle experience. It's going to be a bit of wobbling. So you're a degree here, a degree there. That's fine. The problem is what effectively happened was that there was an accumulator, and it should have been reset each time you wiggle this way, then you wiggle that way. You're not supposed to accumulate the overall angle. You know, if I wiggle 1 degree clockwise and then 1 degree counterclockwise, that should mean that I've ended up at 0 degrees. What about accumulating at 2 degrees? Well, that effectively happened. An erroneous off vertical angle and deduced a negative altitude. This parenthetical remark is brilliant. Cosine of angles greater than 90 degrees are negative. In other words, as far as the software was concerned, the craft had flipped over. And do you know how much code there was to handle such a crazy situation? Precisely none whatsoever, because somebody said this can't happen. Because logically speaking, it should not happen. The problem with dispassion is that although sometimes it grants us objectivity, if we are good at that, being objective is a skill. It's not a free ride. You don't just turn off your emotions. To become better at being objective, it takes an immense amount of discipline. And I'm going to say that with something like science, science is a discipline. It's not a thing. It's not peeling back the layers of the noise that society gives us. It's actually a learned thing. Being logical is a thing you learn. It's not a thing that's innate. Being rational and objective is a thing that is a learned skill. You don't get it for free. It's not like there when you were born and we get noise that masks it and you have to pull it back. That is a hard skill. And if we don't do that, what we end up with is kind of a fake dispassion. It's a fake objectivity. We're actually not seeing things with, we're not seeing a bigger view of things. We're actually seeing a narrow view of things, exactly the opposite. And a failure to understand conditions because we lack the imagination and looseness to throw a crazy idea. What if the craft believes it's flipped over? Oh, that'll never happen. We dismiss it. We're not embracing. We're not working loosely enough. So what actually happened? Because everybody wants to know the end of the story. The fateful miscalculation set off a cascade of despair. That is a phrase I invite you to use in future meetings. A cascade of despair. Beautiful. Triggering the premature release of the parachute, the back shell, a brief firing of the brake thrusters. Because don't forget, The craft thinks it's underground, but it's fully clothed. It's still wearing parachutes and back shells and the whole bit. It's just like, I need to get rid of this stuff. Sadly, all this happened nearly 4 kilometers above the ground, and Mars's gravity may be lower, but a 3,700 meter drop is still a 3,700 meter drop, and indeed the crater was visible from orbit from the rest of the ExoMars mission. So we have these blind spots, and this idea of the real trick with dispassion is not disconnection. It's not the simple detachment. It is the getting another point of view. It actually requires us to be a little bit looser in how we think. But there's also something else. What can we do? Can we learn from our experience? If you're going to be successfully dispassionate, it involves being empirical. It means making observations about the way the world is, not the way you believe it to be. And it turns out that we know an answer to this. It's called testing. And one of my favorite papers on this topic, it's one of those, everything you need to know is said in the name. Simple testing can prevent most critical failures. There you go. An analysis of production failures in distributed data-intensive systems. And the observation, almost all catastrophic failures are the result of incorrect handling of non-fatal errors explicitly signaled in software. That bias, we talked about this idea of dispassion being free from bias, but we have a bias. We have a huge set of biases. We have blind spots in how we think. So this kind of suggests we need to get other people involved, but also when we are trying to be more rational and more objective, that is a learned skill. It is a stepping back and embracing what might initially seem ridiculous. And using that constructively and then learning that for next time. The interesting observation here, majority of the production failures can be reproduced by a unit test. And that's a fairly major observation. It's not necessarily that we could have caught them in advance, but once we have caught them, we can embody that as a regression test and never have to do that problem again. So when it comes to testing, let's start embracing back to the unit. I mean, there's rational reasons we should test, but I'm going to offer you something completely different. James Grenning's observation in his book on TDD for embedded C, in describing TDD and the mechanics of it, he opens with TDD is fun. There it is. As he's not appealing to productivity. He's not appealing to objectivity. He's not appealing to any of these other qualities. He's talking about something that we normally associate again with passion. So it turns out the passion is kind of like, as with dispassion, it's this mixed bag. But that enjoyment idea of getting to the end of the day and having had fun is really interesting. I mean, he then goes on to say it's like a game. Okay, he's using the gaming metaphor. And importantly, when it comes to a game, the bit that James doesn't clarify, he says it's like a game where you navigate a maze of technical decisions that lead to highly robust software while avoiding the quagmire of long debug sessions. A strong motivation. We also see the sense of progress is important, because otherwise in knowledge work, we don't get a real sense of progress. It's not like physical construction. When people make parallels of software development to craft, they are normally appealing to something that has a visible and tangible outcome. And importantly, not simply an outcome, but there is a clear signs of progress as you go. Now, software is very abstract in this sense. So anything that can make it feel more real is helpful. It engages us. It also helps us in a very objective sense. But honestly, the TDD is fun is really important. Now, that idea, when I said the game metaphor, we could explore more thoroughly. I'm not going to explore it much more thoroughly now, but one of the things I'm interested in is the idea that when we use game metaphors, and people do love their sporting metaphors, I'm guilty of it as well. When we talk about how to think about teams, how to think about practices, we have them we have the terminology embedded in some of our methodologies. So Scrum, so there's a rugby one, sprint, yeah, that's running, and so on. But the difference here is that the game that we are referring to is an infinite game, not a finite game. The game that we are playing, the one where we navigate a maze of technical decisions, is an infinite game. An infinite game is unbounded. The goal of a finite game is to win. That's football, that's rugby, that's running. The goal of an infinite game is to keep on playing the game. So product development is not really is not really a finite game. The goal of good product development, the goal of iterative development that gives us good product development, the goal of the code that goes into iterative development to give us the product development, the goal of tests and all the rest of it is to keep on playing the game. The goal is to not stop. It is not to reach a point and say, we're done. So there's a bigger picture here, and one that we need to recognize relates to the human condition. Fun is okay. We can talk about fun. It's basically on topic for software, although we try and hide the language away. And we need to acknowledge that our brain is a mess. It's a haphazard evolution of things. It is not a logical entity. So for trying to fake up being a computer whilst being a developer and claiming that things are logical and rational when perhaps they're not is really an overstatement. As Gary Marcus in his book Cluj observed, are human beings noble in reason and infinite in faculty, as William Shakespeare famously wrote, perfect in God's image, as some biblical scholars have asserted? Kind of big understatement there. We are driven by many different things, which leads us to the idea of compassion. That is the third passion I want to draw your attention to. And one, so far I've talked as if this is just a line, and then I kind of alluded to other people and said this is important, but I haven't really, it's not a simple spectrum. That's a starting position. Let us move away from passion versus dispassion to recognize there's something there. But I want to create a third point here that shows you it's a landscape, not a simple line. Compassion, sympathetic consciousness of others' distress together with a desire to alleviate it. If someone shows kindness and caring and a willingness to help others, they're showing compassion. Now, that is quite an important consideration. It is what we're doing there is describing, and quite literally, it's actually, let's look at the term. It is compassion. If passion is suffering, com means with, is to suffer with somebody, is to understand where they're coming from. And that's really the secret to an infinite game. Okay. The bit that is often neglected when people talk about craft, sometimes we focus too much on the individual thing. It's a very helpful metaphor in some ways, but sometimes we fail to take on board the other aspect, which is community, and that and other people, the role of other people. And we're really bad at other people, particularly when we start treating people in this kind of dispassionate way. Now, I don't really like calling out individual firms and stuff like that, but hell, I'm going to. Revolut, they're a nasty bunch of folks, internally, their structure. And so and given that this is public information, I have no compunction in sharing this. This is from a couple of years back. And this is so this is from the head, Nikolai Staronsky. The bit that I want to focus your attention on, I noticed several product owners and team leaders are significantly below targets. This is when people talk about targets, they're doing fake science. Particularly when we're dealing with something like complex, like software development or business, we are reducing things in a way that gives us this feeling that we might be doing science, but actually we're not. It's a rigged game, and we end up failing to understand the human condition. We reward the wrong behaviors. So below targets and still do not work on weekends to catch up. There is a simple rule in place. POs and team members with performing ratings significantly below expectations will be fired without any negotiations after the review. People and teams rated below expectations will be placed on watch list. Science fiction author John Brunner captured it perfectly. If there is such a phenomenon as absolute evil, it consists in treating another human being as a thing. This is not compassionate. If we wish to run a business, if you wish to nurture an idea that software development is a valuable use of somebody's time, value is not simply constructed in terms of this idea of value, monetary value that flows into a business, or monetary value that we create for a client. There has to be something more. And when we talk about craft in isolation from the human condition, and I know that there are certain key figures who shall remain nameless who are incredibly bad at this, they separate it from the human condition as if that is not a thing to do. It is just an individual striving. That's part of it. But there's this idea of something bigger, and that this may be a little foreign to many of us simply because of our road through and our path through the profession. But that doesn't mean that you can never turn around and go, you know what makes a difference? And you can always think of that boss who helped, that work colleague who helped. And you think, maybe it wasn't just their cool coding skills. maybe there was something else. I learned a lot from them, and half of it was osmotic, and it was about something else. Or even, and I had this, I failed to learn something until years later. So I quite like the perspective that April Wenzel offers us, new compassionate tech values. And she basically went through and kind of got away from the kind of the programmer culture really strongly by saying, look, let's just go through these things that we see manifested and replace them with things that are actually we know to be good for people, but also we know to be good for the business as a whole, and we know to be good from the point of view of learning. If we are dealing with a profession where we are always dealing with incomplete knowledge, and as I said earlier, incomplete knowledge, and we are trying to straddle these multiple worlds, the world of the technical and the crisp and the world of humans and uncertainty. That's the bit that's interesting in the long run. That's the infinite game. Let's replace the ego and demonstrations of ego. This is really hard to do at times when that's been the culture we've been exposed to. Humility. Get rid of the elitism and replace it with inclusion. It's very easy accidentally to be elite and to exclude people. Perhaps we've all done it at one time or another in just passing comments, but there is this idea of like, yeah, if we're serious about this stuff, then that's one of the key ideas. Competition works for finite games, but we're not playing a finite game. We are genuinely all in this together. It is the infinite game is to allow us to keep on playing the game. And to replace the fixed mindset that you are one thing and always have been. You are smart. And, you know, smart is one of those words that we sometimes use to say that somebody's intelligent, but a bit of a dick. Learning, that is the greatest skill. And instead of trashing hotel rooms, being a mentor, always recognize that sometimes but also when people are demonstrating the things on the left-hand side, we also need to be compassionate. We can't just call them out for being a dick, like I just did. You know, we need to understand everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Be kind, always. That's potentially really hard. But also be kind to yourself. I know a lot of developers who have struggled with this, and whether it is imposter syndrome, whether it is struggling with a sense that they are not as good as their colleagues appear to be or project confidence in. There is a whole dimension here of health by convincing ourselves either to fly off the handle and be passionate or to be utterly dispassionate and logical. We are doing ourselves a disservice. And there are mental health consequences. But one of my favorite observations on all of this, and let's go back to that overtime culture, Hillel Wayne, who he's known, you're not aware of him, he's a formal methods guy. And you think, oh, formal methods, that's all dispassion and logic and all the rest of it. One of my favorite observations of his is, as he says, one of my most controversial software opinions is that your sleep quality and stress level matter far, far more than the languages you use or the practices you follow. Nothing else comes close. Not type systems, not TDD, not formal methods, not anything. This really simple idea of actually getting a decent night's sleep and having a comfortable work environment and feeling okay to code. Feeling that it's okay to ask a question about something you're not sure about. Feeling that it's okay to change a test and have it fail, change it back. And it's okay, we tried an experiment, it didn't work out. That is huge. Otherwise, we lose that the very thing that allows us to be loose and creative. We're actually working against ourselves. So this is a book from the School of Life, Calm, which is a serene cover. But I think it's written by Alain de Botton. I really love the observation about this recognition. As I said, skills, we have a blind spot when it comes to this whole thing of other people. We think that simply by having other people, we're adding to the ability to produce software, but actually there's something different here. There's a set of skills. These are learned. To work with other people is a learned skill. Again, that's not one that's innate. To get good at it is the difference between a group of people and something that we could call a team. We don't develop proper recognition for the skills and qualities of mind that in fact help make collaboration successful, productive, and enjoyable. That these are valuable qualities on their own. The task of collaboration is in fact beautiful and serious. I love this contrast here. It is one of the grandest undertakings to coordinate the efforts of groups of peoples. In an interview a couple of years back, I kind of pointed out, okay, biggest advantage of autonomously working teams. I was asked, what is the biggest advantage? I said, is risk reduction through increased group intelligence. We'll never eliminate risk, but what you can do is reduce your exposure to uncertainty. That is risk. Reduce the risk. What is it that could surprise us? Take advantage of the fact that you've got potentially a group of people. It's group intelligence, but that's a learned skill. This idea of mentoring is that's how we increase the game. Brandon Schwartz's idea, we have this idea of the 10x developer, which I think is a toxic and dangerous idea. When we look at software development from a collaborative and team perspective, the 10x developer produces 10 times more code, probably 10 times more problems. It's all the other developers who are more understated, perhaps a little less sure of themselves, who are busy picking up the pieces. And sometimes people are not intentionally brash in doing this. I have more than one occasion worked with somebody who was the smart person who has produced a model that is profound and our business is going to be based on it, but the code is shit and they've got no way of explaining it. That is a profound failure. That is not 10x development. We've caused other people 10 times the amount of work. To be a 10x developer, be a good developer who helps 10 other people get better at what they do. So this idea of group intelligence is not simply an additive one. There's little correlation between a group's collective intelligence and the IQs of its individual members. If a group includes more women, its collective intelligence rises. This was an observation, a finding made in some research 9 years ago by Nita Woolley and Thomas Malone. And this is kind of quite an interesting one. There's this whole idea, and we see that feeding into the modern conversation about diversity, representation, and inclusion. We have a habit of recruiting in our own image, because that's a very human thing to do. That is a kind of side effect of who we are. But there is this idea of, if you're recruiting lots of people like yourself, the same kind of background, the same educational background, same age group, and so on, you are drawing from a relatively narrow pool. Now, why would you do that? Because it gives you confidence. There's familiarity. Of course, in that sense, it feels like you're de-risking things, but actually you're increasing the risk, because what you're doing is you've ended up with more people, but actually less of a range of thinking. If you're recruiting people like yourself, then actually you've basically got yourself. We need more intelligence. If you're going to do something like software development, you have to make that a bigger field. You don't want everybody thinking the same, because otherwise you're not really thinking. So there's this whole idea that by looking at the composition, people are not simply additive in a very simple way, adding numbers to a team and falling into that kind of Revolut mindset and trap of just bodies on seats, where a lot of the skill, when we look at the craft and community idea, when we should be looking a little more, not just at can I do TDD better, which is certainly something that I spend a lot of time dealing with, but actually, are we getting better with respect to collectively being smarter? Are we getting smarter? And it turns out that being the same person many times, or variations of the same person, is not helpful. You need to change the style of thinking. It is not a simple additive quality. And this allows us, if you want objectivity, this is how you do it. We're not going to insource it. We're not intrinsically good at that. We have to outsource. We have to get other people to help us. That is what distributed or collective intelligence is all about. So I talked about the full stack earlier on. And this is one of those things that I always kind of think. We tend to think of the full stack, and obviously people use the phrase full stack, and actually what you'll discover is that they mean I do JavaScript at the front end and the back end, and I talk to a database. In most cases, that's what full stack development means. Having come from the world of kind of real-time and systems programming, I'm kind of thinking there's an awful lot of stack beneath that tiny, tiny fraction that you call the front end and the back end. There's an awful lot there. That's a full stack. But even my view on that is incomplete. It turns out that the rest of the stack is out there. It's outside this constructed world that we have created, and it involves other people. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. The next time I have a release delayed, I look forward to saying that was because of a cascade of despair.
Absolutely. Honestly, really embrace the opportunity to use phrases like that. You mean the release anomaly? Yes, that resulted from a cascade of despair. So really just go for it.
Yeah. It reminds me when I was doing philosophy, and we used to debate if existential angst could be used as a valid reason for delaying submitting an essay, So
Yeah, I think there is. And so actually, yeah, so you didn't make the release. Yeah, existential angst overwhelmed us.
Yeah. So if we submitted a release of this quality, that would be implying that we wish the whole world to submit releases of this quality, and that would be an unbearable burden. So absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. And that does connect directly to the human condition. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. So I have some questions. So first of all, do you consider passion to be a sign of amateurism? In other words, if I'm going in for an operation or if I'm taking a flight, I want a very calm, bored surgeon, or I don't want a pilot rushing through the delivery lounge going, "This is going to be great, folks," So
Yeah. I think that's a very good way of looking at it. In fact, if we look at these passions as being things that keep one another in check. If you have too much, if you have too much of the passion and not enough of the other stuff, then it's kind of like, okay, that's unchecked, and I think that's a good way of looking at it. Amateurism, in other words, that might be what gets you into the field, but it can't be what you take all the way through. You want to have that balance. You want to have the calm and collected surgeon. You want the surgeon who cares enough about people, but cares enough so much that they are prepared to take a step back and say, I'm going to get good at this. I'm focusing on this. I recognize there's a human life involved, all the rest of it. And that is their perspective. So you want that. But yeah, people might get into a field because of passion, but that shouldn't be the only thing. They can't just use that all the way through. Otherwise, it becomes very lopsided. And in a professional capacity, they end up behaving as amateurs. So I think that's a really good insight.
Yep. So then, but following on from that, when and where should you draw the line between passionate and dispassionate? At what point are you making the switch?
Oh yeah, so I think that's a difficult question. Perhaps we need to kind of phrase it differently. That rather than thinking about it as being a line that we kind of cross, let's think about those as two forces that are pulling us, and that there's constantly this kind of like we're looking for a balance. We're looking for an equilibrium. And it is a dynamic equilibrium. And perhaps there isn't an easy line to spot, but it is a kind of a sensing. It's how we stand. Standing is actually quite a surprisingly active process. We think of standing as static, but actually what people are constantly doing is a constant adjustment. Your body is taking feedback. Yeah. So I can't tell you where the line is, but I can tell you to know when you've gone too far this way or too far that way. Mm-hmm. It's that observation of are people saying different things, or am I being nudged in a particular direction? Is people around me, is their behavior changing? On the one hand, so whenever I'm there, is that things I'm doing, or am I not getting as much from this meeting as I got from last month's meeting? Are people being a little more frustrated? Oh, that must be them, is our default answer. Actually, maybe it's us. Mm-hmm. We have to ask that question. On the other hand, there's the other domain. Do you notice when you're error prone? I am much, much better at spotting when I am busy making mistakes. In fact, one of my favorite stories about TDD is from a personal experience, is when I was when I had jet lag, hideous jet lag, and I was writing code at a client site, and I started thinking, oh, you know what, maybe I'll just forget, I won't really bother with the tests, and I'll come back tomorrow and do all of that. I'll just get the code out. And then I won't say it was an epiphany, but I think it was more the angel of my better nature tapped me on the shoulder and said, you do know that you're going to spend all of tomorrow making up for today's mistakes. And I kind of thought, actually, you know what? Instead of trying to write the code that I was going to write, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write more tests. I'm going to slow down. I'm going to get up, get myself, had enough coffee. I'm just like this. I need to go and get some water, and I come back. I'm going to write a test. I'm going to write some more tests. I think I'll be writing some tests, but I'm going to make this thing bulletproof, so that the smallest thing that I do will be caught. In other words, recognizing that idea that doesn't mean that my tests were right, but you're more likely to do more good than harm by doing that. And that's and seeing yourself going like, you know what? I'm making a lot of mistakes. I'm frustrated. Oh, now I'm getting really frustrated with myself. I just need to type more or do. No, take a step back. So if you like, that's your equilibrium. It's what's happening with the things that I'm working on and what's happening with the people that I'm working with. That's where you're looking for that balance.
Cool. And just a point from myself, I love the idea that you brought out that progress is key to passion, because if you aren't making insufficient progress, then your level of passion for something will inevitably.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is very delicate balance. It's a very difficult chemistry.
Very good. And then, do you think that the things that we're passionate about, in software change over time? So I've noticed it myself, and I see it in people like yourselves and so on, that people start out being very passionate about language X, and then over time they get more passionate about methodology X, and then finally they end up at the end of their career being passionate about people, So
yeah, I think there is a progression, and I think, but I think it may generalize within different people in different ways. Because I made this, I had a conference call for some business yesterday, and I would never put myself forward as being a JavaScript developer. And occasionally I will make rude jokes about JavaScript because, hey, why not? But I make rude jokes about almost every language that I have either worked in or not worked in. I regard nothing as sacred at that level. So perhaps in the past, and for various people, I'm associated with various languages, and they're always surprised that I will quite happily diss the very language they associate with me and make nice comments about another language, or recommend a language and then make nasty comments about it. Because what I'm doing is I say, well, I like languages. It turns out that I used to like particular languages, but I've actually realized over time, oh no, I can't like the whole programming language idea, and they're all flawed. They are produced by people, and they are consequences of business. They're always going to be imperfect, but that doesn't stop them being fun and interesting. So in that sense, the direction changes. And I think for some people, there is a clearer progression. What they do is they're always trying to solve one thing, and then they realize actually that's a solved problem. It's the context around it, which ultimately leads to, I started with a programming language. This programming language will make you better. You know what? We needed a little bit more thinking around it and how we organize our thoughts. And that kind of leads into, well, maybe it's how the people work. And then, in other words, there is a zooming out and seeing the bigger picture. The danger there is that we lose sight of the fact that actually some of this stuff, this detail, is surprisingly important, but the zooming out is part of the process. And I think there's value in that. But what makes it more effective is if you don't lose sight of the connections between each layer or each level of interest. It's when you see that, you go, oh, okay, it's way more complex and more interesting than I originally anticipated.
I think when I was starting out myself, I kind of just tried to look at a language as a language divorced from everything else. But after time, you realize that there's also a business context. Will this actually help anybody make money? And then there's a social context. Does this have a positive community about it? Will it help developers mature and become better and happier at what they do?
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting one, because I find, so going back to the passion aspect, I find that what drives me is finding that right level of passion. I really like this stuff, and it is kind of almost a sense of like, you almost want somebody else, and this bleeds into compassion. You want to share that with somebody. You want to say, look, this is interesting and fascinating. Perhaps you don't know enough about it, or perhaps you haven't. Let me show you this. This is where I'm coming from. And they'll say, well, this is how I thought of it. And you go, I never thought of it like that. And you walk away being the person who's changed. I think that's massively exciting. And that, I think, that's the passion. That's why so a few years ago, so this talk comes out of this kind of wrestling of like, passion is great. Dispassion is like, and I saw a talk. Dispassion is where we want to be. And I thought, yes, that's right. Except I don't know. It's not that easy. So it's just trying to find that balance.
And final question, and then I think we have to wrap up. But do you feel that the way passion is being used at the moment, we're setting other things aside, but the way that passion is being used right now, is that overall reinforcing positives or negatives in our industry?
I think it's reinforcing negatives. I do not, as I said in those job ads and things, so that's, I guess my goal here is to try and say, yes, but there's I want to say yes and, but I think there's a yes, but as well. I want to say, actually, passion is quite important, but it doesn't, perhaps it's not as simple as we thought it was, and it's not as one-dimensional, but the way that it's being projected does make me understand why I might want to totally take it out of my vocabulary, because I think it's being used to oversimplify things, to cheapen things, including the nature of our work. It's being used as a substitute for, we need you to be passionate. Why? Because the team sucks. that, okay, we have no team concept here. It's not that the individuals suck, it's just we have no nurturing. There's no concept here. Oh, the code is crap, so you're gonna need a lot of self-motivation here. All this kind of stuff. We're using it as a prop to prop up and compensate for something that is missing. And we clearly need to put that other something there in place. So I think the currency of passion, that word has value, but we've cheapened it.
Very good. Excellent. Well, time marches on, so I have to thank you for an
Thank you very much.
And hope to see you again. And thank you so much. Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye-bye. Bye. Excellent. So, Tim, if I can now call you forward to do the second talk.
Good afternoon.
Over to you.
All right. Let's find the share screen button. All right, go for it. Okay. I'm going to follow Kevlin's advice here and take my headphones off. So my talk is entitled Curate Your Craft, and this is more of a practical idea from sort of Kevlin's more sort of, if I want to say, ephemeral. But so I guess we'll start with me. So who am I? So my name's Tim Cooke. I'm the engineering lead at Axial 3D, which is a Belfast-based 3D medical printing company. We take things like this, which is a CT scan or an MRI scan, and we turn them into this. So this is a physical 3D printed model. So in this case, this is a 1-to-1 scale model of a child's spine and rib cage. And this child has scoliosis, which is a curvature of the spine. And surgeons will use this for pre-surgical planning. So my corporate overlords have asked me to mention that we are hiring for a pretty key position at the moment, which is the Chief Product Officer. My narrative says we're just going to ask for somebody with a passion for product development, but since the previous talk, I might revise that to say we're looking for somebody with skills and extensive experience in product development and the desire to help us change the face of healthcare globally forever. So if that's you, we want to hear from you, and you can find out details about that on the hub.io /startup/Axial3D, and the job stuff is on there. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? I am going to talk about some pretty practical things that that I have discovered throughout my career to be of value. And these are practical things that you have and things that you would do. So I'm going to talk about some practices that you can employ to make yourself create some productive habits. I'm going to talk about some choices that you would make, particularly in the tools that you can adopt to support you in your practices and how to become skilled in those things. We're going to talk about the things that you might wish to fill your brain with. What do you want to learn? Our brain is a finite capacity, so we can't learn everything as much as we would love to. So let's pick some things that would serve us throughout our career and not just for the current project. We're going to talk about practice. Learning is not everything. We need to practice to become skilled at those things. So I'm going to talk about some ways in which you can do that. I'm going to talk about how to make good decisions that you are less likely to regret in the future. And to wrap it up, we're going to talk about some interpersonal things, which I think will help you throughout your career. So why do I feel like I need to put together a whole talk all about this? Well, they say that an expert is someone who has made all of the mistakes there are to be made in their field. I am absolutely not going to put it out there that I'm an expert in anything at all, but I for sure have made some mistakes all throughout my career. So I want to share with you what some of those mistakes were, what some of the things that I have identified as good things to do so that you don't have to make the same mistakes. So I want to make your journey better than mine, and I want you to be more successful than me. And I hope that this will give you some guidance into achieving that. So let's start with practices. I'm going to start with a little story. So I have a friend of mine, and she is a very skilled developer. She works for a bank in New York. She is a conference speaker multiple times. She is one of the most prolific admins on a programming forum site. She is a volunteer tutor for a kids robotics team. She's a distinguished Toastmaster. She's an author of multiple books, and she blogs about stuff all the time. Somebody asked her once, how do you do all of this stuff? I just can't get my head around how you manage to achieve all of these things and be so good at these things. And do you know what she said? She said, I'm really good at time management. That was the end of her explanation. I'm really good at time management. Now I'd extrapolate that out to say that she's really good at task management as well. It's a really simple concept, but it's basically capture the things you want to do and organize your time to do those things. It sounds really simple, and many of us, myself included, find it extraordinarily difficult to actually achieve that. So some of the tools that I would use for task management, there's lots there. I use Trello because it's nice and simple. I know people who use Wunderlist, there's Google Keep. Some people just keep a notepad and a pencil or a book and keep it in their pocket. Time management is an interesting one. As a developer, one of the things that I found most beneficial to manage my time when I'm actually developing is the Pomodoro technique. So that is the idea where you have 25 minutes of focused work with 5-minute break in between. But when I say focused work, I turn off my email, I turn off my Slack, I turn off everything. I'm just doing a thing, one thing, and one thing only for 25 minutes. I can commit to that. It's harder to commit to say I'm going to do this thing for 2 hours. For 25 minutes, yeah, we can do that. But the key thing is do one thing at a time. Humans are very bad at multitasking. Just pick a thing and do that thing. From a software development point of view, test-driven development really changed the way that I worked as a practice for developing code. Kevlin mentioned this a bunch of times, but the two key things that it really did for me is it really made me think about, do I understand what I'm trying to do? If I can't write a test that's specific enough to say what it is I want to achieve, how am I going to achieve that? And the second thing that it does for me is it tells me when I'm finished. Previously, when I didn't write tests and I wasn't so good at writing tests, I'd write my code and I kind of poke it and think, yeah, that looks all right. Seems like it does what I want it to do. But I always had like what about this edge case? I'm not really sure. What about that thing I did last week? Does that still do what it needs to do? Not sure. Test-driven development really gives me that confidence that when my tests pass and I can't think of any more tests to write, I'm pretty confident that I've achieved what I need to do. And maybe that feeds into Kevlin's idea where being able to sleep at night, I can go to sleep knowing that I can sleep better because I've got a much better confidence that what I did today was actually of good quality. So you kind of go into this cycle. If you write a test, you make it pass and you do some refactoring, which we'll talk about in a second. And then we go on until you can't think of any more tests. So then I wondered, well, how do I know when I've finished, when I've written enough tests? And it's kind of a personal thing, but a wise man once said some years ago, as an answer to this question, he said, you test until the fear goes away. And we all had a little laugh at that, but it really stuck with me. And I think that's really what it is. And that wise man was Garth Gilmour, our host and final speaker. But that really stuck with me. It was like, test until the fear goes away. Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up for me. So the other practice that I found as really valuable as a software engineer is the ability to do refactoring. Now, refactoring is being able to change the internal organization and structure of your code without affecting the external behavior. You kind of want to let that sink in for a minute. It's a really profound thing to be able to do. And if you become skilled at this, you are able to change the internal organization. You can get rid of that really nasty thing that's been developed some time ago and it's horrible. It allows you to tackle things like that in safety, knowing that you haven't changed the external behavior. It's really powerful thing. And I think if more engineers were very skilled in refactoring, I feel happier for it, and I think it's a very good thing. The last thing is pair programming. You will be surprised at the kind of level of quality you get from pair programming. And this is funny. This little meme here, this little comic here is quite funny, but it's so true. If you're on your own, you'd feel, I'll just do that. I'll just name my variable A for now. I'll come back and fix it later. But the minute you put two people next to each other and start doing the same thing, and you've got the guy next to you going, no, come on. Don't do that. You're better than that. Okay. And it's completely this. Oh, we should start with a unit test. Indeed, old chap. It's profoundly effective at improving the quality of your code. And in practical terms, it actually reduces the amount of rework. If you are able to measure the amount of rework you were doing, I'll be fairly confident that your rework would be reduced. So choices. So what tools can you choose that would help you to support you in those practices? The software world is full of choices. There's so much of it, and it's ever changing. So where do you start? Where do you stop? So I think of my brain and the things that I know and the skills that I have as my developer's toolkit. They're the things that I have, which I can call upon and get out of my toolkit to be able to do my job as a software engineer. So the key, I think, is if you can fill your toolkit with tools that you can reuse over and over again, that will give value and help you multiple times and throughout your career, those are valuable things. So in the software world, these are things like tools for doing refactoring and stuff like that. But what it doesn't include, and it's not to say that these things are unimportant, but things like software frameworks and libraries and like third-party tools and all these kind of things, those kind of things come and go, and it's valuable to you know those things for a particular time, but you also know that those things have like limited scope. So, I mean, most of us, when we start on a project, the programming language has largely been chosen for us most of the time, unless you're on a greenfield project where you literally have nothing. So you obviously have to learn the language, but what else can you learn and put in your toolbox that will help you become better at dealing with that language? Well, maybe think about the paradigm. So like I've spent most of my time doing Java programming. So learning Java programming is fine, but to kind of take a step back and think, well, what kind of paradigm is that? Okay, well, that's an object-oriented programming paradigm. So what if I learn that and I get some skills around that? Well, that's going to help me deal with the language itself better, because I now understand why things are a certain way. And even in more recent times where Java's taken in sort of functional programming paradigms, figuring out what functional programming is helps you understand and work with the language. So like I'm a Java guy, but if you're doing Python or I don't know, Erlang or whatever, it's the same kind of thing. Figure out what the paradigm is, and I think it helps you understand the language better. So when you're in when you're working as a software developer in industry, you generally your programs are non-trivial. So when you get out of the sort of non-trivial sort of one or two files kind of thing, kind of building those into runnable artifacts becomes really unwieldy. So build tools are one thing which I recommend you put in your toolkit. So for me, Java programmer, my build tool is Maven. That's the one I use the most. But that's in my toolkit, so I know that if I'm on a Java project, I know that I can use Maven and I can build up my runnable artifact. So that's a valuable tool to have, and that will carry me through past the current project. I mean, that's a long-term tool for me. And I know that there's other exist, Gradle exists. I'm not so skilled on that. Maven does everything I need for that. So I'm not really I don't really feel like I have to learn all of the build tools for Java. I just pick one that works for me. So unit testing is a very important skill to have. And knowing your test tools to do that is another thing for your toolkit. So my tool for that is JUnit, maybe Python. There's a PyTest, I'm not too sure. But whatever language it is you're working in, know your test tools. Know how to run unit tests, know how to, what the syntax is for writing your unit tests, know how to get the reports from your unit tests. Very important. So we talked about the practice of doing refactoring just previously. So think about some tools for that. If there's any tools that you can have to make that quicker and easier and more reliable, then absolutely lean on those things. So this one leads in, for me, then this leads into the next option tool, which is your IDE. So I choose IntelliJ as my IDE for Java. And I've chosen that because the refactor tools are extraordinarily good. Having come from using Eclipse for a long period of time before that, it was those refactor tools that really got me to choose IntelliJ as my IDE. So for your language, you may use different IDEs and you may get different refactor tools. But understand that having those tools is going to support you in your practices. So if you can find those tools and put them in your toolkit, then I think you're in a good place. Again, IDE, people get very sort of I don't know, possessive about their IDEs. Like I'm Eclipse, like long live Eclipse, death to all other IDEs. Try not to be like that. Be rational about it. Choose your IDE, understand why you've chosen it. Maybe you like the key bindings, maybe you're just familiar with it. In my case, it was the refactor tools that got me to IntelliJ. But on the other hand, I know that Eclipse, there's a plugin for Eclipse called Infinitest, which automatically runs your test tools every time you save a file. It's incredible. I absolutely love it. It's not so good on IntelliJ, but the refactor tools does it for me. So it's a trade-off. But so choose your IDE, become really skilled at it. That's the thing. When you see someone who's working with their IDE and they've got all the key maps and they can switch between things and do stuff, I mean, and they haven't touched their mouse for the last 15 minutes. Like, it looks amazing, but it's really productive as a workflow, and you can move really fast, move really quickly doing that. So I recommend choosing your IDE and becoming really skilled with it. These things, you may or may not get involved in these. Like, I know when I've worked in a big corporate companies before, the delivery tools are essentially the domain of another team. Like, I would be a software engineer, and sort of my remit ends when I've checked in the code and I've verified that it's all the tests pass and it's of good quality. So the delivery tools become the domain of someone else. But when you're in a smaller company, such as I am now, you become more involved in the end-to-end process. So knowing your delivery tools, picking your tools to be able to take your stuff out of your source control and deliver that into a runnable artifact and put that on some kind of platform which is going to serve your customers. There's lots of tools around there. I'm not going to propose that you need to do this one or that one, but it's just choose one, get to know it, and kind of put that in your toolkit, and that will serve you well. So the last one is, well, I say the last one, it's not the last one. So know your operating system. You're developing stuff to go onto an operating system. So know how to get around that. If you're a developer, you're not a sysadmin. You don't have to support the platform. You don't need to know all the ins and outs of everything, but knowing how to get around it, knowing how your processes run, knowing how to inspect your processes, and just kind of do sort of general things like that. Just kind of pick these things up as you go along. I've been dug out of a hole on every now and again. I'll dig myself out of a hole with doing some awk stuff. You know, this is a language that's been around for decades, but my goodness, do you look like an absolute hero to your boss if you can do that. But it's one of those things. It's in my toolkit. It's in the back of the toolkit. I know it's there. I'll go and get it if I need it. But it's just good to have familiarity of the platform that you're developing for. Debug tools is deliberately at the bottom of the list. If I'm breaking out my debugger, I'm in deep trouble. Like, I'm in real trouble if I'm trying to break out the debugger. But I have a couple that I use, and I kind of know how to use them, and I know where to go to refresh myself to figure out how to use it. They're in the back of my toolkit. You know, have them there as a backup. if you're having to debug a live system, like you're in a world of pain, but being able to know how to do it is very much valuable. So we'll move on to learning. So I mentioned earlier, like our brain has a finite capacity. So we want to be a little bit selective about what we put in it. So there's lots of different ways you can learn, like books, videos, or online things. I don't really have a great opinion about those. Personally, I like books. I think that's maybe a generational thing. And like when I was at school, there was no YouTube, there was no Manning live video or Coursera or Udemy or any of those things. So I kind of like, I just like books. That's just me. But be selective in what you learn. You can't learn everything. So I would say try and learn the things that are going to serve you the longest throughout your career. So favor fundamentals over frameworks. So for example, when I first started off my career, I was in a consultancy house and I got shipped off to a customer, and it was a web-based Java application. It wasn't web-based, it kind of was, I won't go into that. But it was Java Swing was the UI framework for it, and it used struts as your kind of root dispatching thing. And I come away from that contract thinking, that's really great. I've learned new things, and I've learned how to use Swing, and I've learned how to use struts, and I never used them again. Not once, ever. And to be honest, some of you are probably wondering, what is struts? What is Swing? I've never heard of these things. And that's really the point, is that frameworks and things like that come and go. But if you can focus your learning on the fundamentals, like I've met some Angular engineers who are really good at Angular, really not very good at JavaScript. And it really limits their ability for Angular. It really kind of, I think it limits their scope of being able to reason with things. But sort of favor the fundamentals definitely over frameworks. Like I'm a books guy, so I recommend some books that I think have certainly helped me and have been like pivotal learning points for me. This one here is not actually a programming book. It's written by programmers, so it has a kind of a programming edge to it. But it really kind of gets you thinking about, kind of teach you how your brain works. So this thing will kind of make sense of the reason why you, if you're watching a TV show, you cannot think of that actor's name. No matter how hard you try, you just can't do it. But yet, the next day when you're on the train, you'd be like, Lawrence Fishburne, that's him. It's a really interesting read. It's not actually that big a book, but it really kind of gets you to know how your brain works, which might help you kind of trick it into doing the things that you want, or at least kind of build your practices around, actually, I can't think of that now. I'm not going to think about it. I'll leave it and it will come to me later. This one here is probably not really a classic one, but it was really like a pivotal moment, and it really increased my skill in unit testing. Loads and loads of tips in here, loads and loads of guides about what type of testing you can do, some tips and tricks about how you can maybe mock out certain things and like wrestle your code a little bit to make it more testable. It's a really good one. It's not actually that old, this one. I think it's 2013, so it's old enough, but I'd recommend that one. This is the classic. There's loads and loads and loads of books and resources and things all about test-driven development. But this is kind of where it started. I mean, this is 2002, so we're like 18 years old. But this is kind of to me, where I'd see the sort of starting point of all of the TDD stuff that came afterwards. And I kind of like the idea that I went back to this book and really looked at it from what was Kent Beck's like original idea around test-driven development. And it really kind of got me into a whole different style of programming. This is the classic. A lot of companies will give you this as your welcome pack. Loads and loads and loads of really simple examples. You could spend a half an hour with this book this afternoon and start employing some of the recommendations straight away. Really accessible. There's loads in it. It's a really good one. So this is the second edition. The first edition of this came out over 20 years ago. Lots and lots and lots of tips about how to refactor your code, which is what I mentioned earlier. It's one of the things I do like about this book is it includes a section on code smells. So it's practical ways and hard ways that you can actually recognize bad designs in your code, and it gives you some suggestions about how to use refactoring tools to undo that and make it nicer. This is another classic. This is kind of gives you lots of sort of foundational practical tips on sort of things you can and should do as a programmer. Kind of takes you from that kind of just sort of programming just coding and then just not really thinking much about it, to giving you a little bit more professionalism. I think Garth will probably undo that term professionalism later on, but we'll go with that. This one absolutely changed the way I view legacy code. And by legacy code, I mean any code base that you come along. Most of the time as a developer, you're going to be working with other people's code. This book single-handedly took the fear out of working with legacy code and existing code bases for me. It literally took the fear out of it for me. And now I enjoy working with existing code bases because I think, oh, I know how I can handle this. I can use things that I learned in this book, and it's a joy. It's amazing. Again, this is a 2004 book. It's not recent, but it's so good. This one here is kind of a more recent one. We're talking about more intermediate advanced levels here, but there were some really interesting ideas about how you can use your source repository history to analyze and identify some hotspots or some tight couplings between components in your system, and kind of identify some sort of problem areas that you might want to attack. It's really interesting. And this one absolutely scared the life out of me. It was how can you write code that is going to survive in production? And it's really profound. There's some really, really great examples in there, but it scared the life out of me because I was thinking, oh, yeah, I did that. Oh, I do that. Yeah, it's definitely worth a read. So learning is fine, but that's only the start. You need to practice these things. And like Kevlin mentioned earlier, that humans are not naturally logical creatures. So to say that you are naturally gifted at programming, well, you're not really. It's not natural. Humans are not precise creatures, and coding necessitates lots of precision. So what can you do to kind of practice your, I don't know, hone your craft, if you like? Code carters are a great one. Small, self-contained code problems that you can usually solve in an hour or two. But the point is that you can solve it in an hour or two. You can then solve it again, try something different. You can maybe give yourself some constraints and say, oh, this time I'm not allowed to use state. Or this time I'm not allowed to use any third-party libraries. Or this time I'm only allowed to use third-party libraries. It's about practicing coding. This book, I'd recommend this book if you're coming in if you're starting to learn a new programming language. So I'm not very good at Python. So I started going through this book using Python, and it kind of gives you sort of 57 sort of fairly structured examples and exercises that you can do whilst getting to know the programming language that you're working on. So it's kind of like a structured and practical. I think the practical thing is the important stuff is you're actually writing code, and it kind of like guides you through these things, and you end up exploring a good deal of your programming language. So I'd recommend that if you're coming at a new language from fresh. Teaching others. If you can't explain something to someone else, then you don't understand it yourself. So I'm not suggesting that you start going for doing keynote presentations at large conferences, but maybe teach to your colleague who sits next to you about something that you just learned. Maybe do a lunch and learn workshop in your workplace on something that you've learned. The act of putting together an explanation of something that you know in a format that other people will understand really uncovers the gaps in your own knowledge and really forces you to really understand things. So these things are kind of it's a personal choice on these. Personally, I would contribute to coderanch.com, have done for many years. It's the same thing again, being able to help somebody respond to a question in written form. It really forces you to organize your thoughts and decide whether you do actually understand what you're trying to help them with. I personally have a personal website that I just kind of put just stuff on, but again, it's that act of formally writing stuff down in some kind of cohesive way, kind of forces you to really think about what you're presenting and what you're talking about. Again, uncovers lots of holes in your knowledge, which is valuable. Decision making is an interesting one. So I would say just make reasoned decisions. But what does that mean? I mean, in the context of software development, like, don't blindly adopt stuff. I've seen lots of code bases where the dependency list is extensive and there's loads of stuff in it, and you think, well, why is that there? And it's a decision has been made in the past that, oh, we need this, I need to do a thing. Oh, this library does this thing, I'm going to do that. For example, one that we had was somebody decided that they're fed up writing getters and setters for their classes, their Java classes. So they adopted this library that did that for them through some annotation. And that was fine. That kind of solved it for them. But what it did is it brought in this really quite large library, which kind of brought it with it maintenance costs with it as well. And we actually ended up having to get rid of it because it was giving us problems trying to update our Java version because it just didn't play nice. So when you're making decisions about anything, whether it's a adoption of a third-party library or a choice of a language or anything like that, really evaluate the value and cost trade-off. Is the value that thing or decision you're making, is that enough to warrant the cost that it brings as well? So Kevlin mentioned this, the 10x developer, and it was about the 10x developer can produce 10 times the amount of code than a normal person. I'll say normal person, but what they're also doing is they're making 10 times as many decisions. But if those decisions are ill thought out, then there's no benefit. You're not actually getting you're not getting anywhere good 10 times faster. You're getting somewhere bad 10 times faster. So yeah, make reasoned decisions. Think about the value cost, especially when you're thinking about the third-party libraries that you adopt in your code as well. I mean, look at the support for it. I mean, if it's on GitHub, GitHub is a great thing. It's opened up the world that anybody can contribute value, and they can create libraries and third-party plugins and so on. And that's a really great thing, But the downside as well is that anybody can publish to it. So you kind of want to evaluate, is this thing supported? Is the person still maintaining it? Have they abandoned it? Because if you adopt this thing, those things are going to be important to you. And largely it's about being able to explain your decisions. That's like when your boss comes to you and says, oh, why did you do this? Well, you can tell him. You evaluated it and you decided that the value outweighed the cost. You decided to use it. That's it. It's a really awkward conversation when your boss says, so why did you do this? And you go, I don't really know. It's less pleasant. So I think the interpersonal part, there's so much to this. I don't think that I'd probably be the right person to go into it. There's certainly multiple talks and there's lots of research and history has gone into this. But if I could say there's one thing that I would recommend from an interpersonal level that would serve you well throughout your career, it's this. Just be nice. That's all. Just be nice. If you're nice, people can work with you. Everybody's happy. And that's all. So if you want to get in touch with me, so there's my Twitter handle. And I'll put the slides and some links to the books and stuff that I recommended there up on my website, timdrivendevelopment.com/craft-bash.
Very good. And we'll of course amplify all of that. Cool. So huge +1 on those books, by the way. Yeah, but very strongly recommended. That they all are great. And thank you for the compliment that you gave me, saying that you write test till the fear goes away. I have to say, I was trained in extreme programming many years ago by a wonderful fellow called Sean Hanley, who run an XP company in Dublin called Software out of the Guinness Enterprise Centre. And he sadly moved over to the US and we lost touch. But that's where I got the idea, because he would always teach that you write unit tests to decrease fear and increase confidence, you know,
Yeah.
and at some point they'll flip over, you know, at some point you'll have more confidence than you have fear. And that's when you start thinking about committing to version control or doing a release or whatever it happens to be.
Absolutely. We all laughed at it at the time, but it stayed with me.
Yep. Very good. Very good. So time's catching up. So I think we've only got time for one question. So whenever it comes to time management, and being strict and so on, how do you get around that classic developer thing where it's like, I have to get X if it kills me, you know, X must be done. You know, I'm at this desk until, you know, X happens. There may be snack breaks, there may be bio breaks, you know, but I do not leave here until X is completed. So how do you get past that?
Well, it depends who is dictating when X needs to be completed. If it's just me, then I'm happy to just crack on. A lot of the time, like the idea that I must get this done is because somebody outside of you has said, you must get this done, you must get this completed. There are only so many hours in a day. You can't cram things into a time box that just doesn't fit. So I would recommend that it's all about managing expectations at that point. If you know you're not going to get something finished by the end of the working day, then you need to say that now, not at the end of the day, because that person's, as far as they're concerned, everything's fine. You're going to get it done by the end of the day. Like, we're all human. We all have limited capacity. We run into unexpected problems. So yeah, it's really manage expectations. Like, don't try and wreck yourself trying to get something done. Don't have sleepless nights because you don't think you're going to get it done. Just be open, be honest, be transparent about what you do. Don't try and be a hero. No one's expecting you to be a hero. Just be honest, do what you can do. And
I think that sums it up beautifully. Don't be a hero, be honest. Don't give in to the imposter syndrome, and just give feedback when something is really hard or you just don't have the right background to do something, you know?
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Absolutely. Very good. Well, listen, thank you so much, Tim. If I can banish you now. So cool. So time is catching up with us. So I think what we'll do is I will deliver my talk, and then, but because time is caught up and Kevlin's away, we won't do the summary group talk at the end. We'll just end there. So let me just share my screen. And just need to adjust my windows a little bit. There we are there. And just move a few windows around. Very good. Right, so the final talk of the day is from myself, and we're going to be discussing as software engineers whether or not we are professionals. Okay, so this should be an interesting talk. So I discussed this in advance with a lot of people, and that they seem to be very invested in this. So hopefully, looking forward to some interesting questions. So please ask questions as we go along. Yep. Right, so you know who I am. So this is the agenda that we're going to be working to. So first of all, what is a profession? Are we professionals? And whether we are or not, does it actually matter? Okay, so number one, what is a profession? Yeah, so whenever we're talking about a profession, we don't just mean your job. Okay, so these days the term is used very loosely to mean your job, your trade, that thing you do for money. Okay, so we mean profession in the original sense. Okay, and you know what that sense is, even if you find it very hard to define it. And again, that may well be part of the problem. Okay. simply because you know there's a thing called professionalism, but not precisely what it is. So I had a traditional Irish education where the teachers were always trying to winnow out the smart kids, and if you were one of the smart kids, if you were sciencey, you were a doctor, and if you were arty, then you were going to be a lawyer. And there was a sense that if you weren't sciencey enough to be a doctor, well, maybe we could drop you down to dentistry or be a vet or something like that. And maybe if you weren't arty enough to be a lawyer, well, maybe you could be an accountant, you know. And everybody else went into the Tim Nice but dim category, if you're familiar with that sketch show. Yeah. So you know what the term professional means, even if you don't quite know how to define it. Okay, so no matter how interesting a job is, being interesting doesn't make it a profession. So there was a town in Japan that was a tourist center with many medieval castles and so on, and a while back they were advertising for ninjas. So that sounds like a fun job, being a professional ninja. But just because something is fun doesn't necessarily make it a profession. We're also not going to talk about whether software engineering is a kind of engineering. Yes, it is. But if you're more interested in that question, this is an absolutely fascinating talk. Okay, so huge hat tip to James, who clued me into this talk. And the speaker actually went out and interviewed a bunch of engineers, civil engineers, chemical engineers, and so on, who'd done work in software as well to get their opinion. So I really recommend that talk there. It's absolutely fascinating. So let's just have a quick go at defining what a profession is, okay? So first of all, you're a profession if your culture tells you so, okay? So let's say you go over to France and you're talking to a French waiter, you know, is that a profession? Absolutely, you know, and you would be a fool to suggest otherwise in France. On the other hand, let's say you were over in the States, yeah? Do they regard a waiter or waitress as being a profession? Probably not, you know, a wonderful quote there from Friends, yeah? So I remember I was in the States and I was talking to my waiter in a restaurant, and I asked him how long he had been a waiter for, and he was at great pains to give me his career plans for the rest of his life, and he was doing this to support his education and so on. And you know, I just asked an innocent question. So you know, depending on your culture, something may or may not be regarded as a profession versus just that thing that you're doing to make money. So for me, one of the things that marks a profession as a profession is that you can keep the job for life, okay? So let's say, as we all will, we pass on, you know, and friends or relatives are clustered around the gravesite, and they go, oh, poor Dave, you know, all that talent, you know, all that promise, all that education, you know, and he was a surgeon all his life or something like that, you know? So one of the things that marks a profession as a profession is that you can do it until you retire, and that's okay. You know, that's fine. Nobody would conceivably criticize you for that. Okay. So if you're like a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher, that's fine. You know, of course, there are levels within it. You know, surgeons want to do more specialist kinds of surgery. Lawyers want to become partners or have their own firm. Teachers want to become the headmaster, headmistress, and so on. You know, so there's different degrees to it, but still, it's something that you can do for the rest of your life. Then there's a period of apprenticeship. So you don't just get your job, get your degree. You get your degree, and then you have to go through a period of professional training with exams before you can be considered a professional. So if you want to be a barrister, it's not just enough to do your law school. You have to do your pupillage. If you want to be a surgeon, you have to do your residency and so on. Then you belong to a guild or union, and not in a casual way. You know, this is like a central part of your professional identity. So if you're a doctor, belonging to the BMA is a big thing and an essential thing for you to practice medicine. You know, if you're a lawyer or an architect or whatever, you know, you have a professional body that you belong to, and that gives you part of your accreditation and so on. And then finally, you follow a formal, legally enforceable code of conduct, okay? So there are codes of conduct for police officers, for doctors, for solicitors, and so on. And if you violate any of these, well, then you're in serious trouble with your professional body at the very least, and quite possibly very, very serious legal difficulties as well, okay? So these are all things that you can consider marking something as a professional, okay? So stage 2, how do we stack up against this? You know, so let's compare software engineering as a profession, you know, against this list, okay? So does our culture tell us so? Nah. Okay, so if you do like a survey of the media, nah, I'm going to have to mark us down for that one. Sadly not. Yeah. So the media does tell us that we're a subculture, but a subculture and a profession are definitely not the same thing. Yeah. So just because we're a readily identified subculture, that doesn't make us a profession. Okay. So what about keeping the job for life? You definitely should be able to. Okay, so I would regard it as a characteristic of a well-run software company. If you could be a software developer in your 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way up until the day you retire. But sadly, as you know, in our industry, there is a large amount of ageism. Yeah, and there's also the feeling that you move on. So you move from junior to senior to architect to project manager to scrum master to consultant. Whatever it happens to be. And also, relating back to previous discussions, being a developer is a very, very stressful activity, because you're expected to have passion, you're expected to be self-learning, as Tim says, there's always this danger that that you feel that you have to push yourself too far, but you shouldn't, but we all feel it, we feel the imposter syndrome and so on. So, have to mark us down for that one as well. Then do we have to go through a period of apprenticeship? Okay. Yeah. So definitely in well-run software companies you do. Okay, so we're all familiar with well-run software companies where you do go through a period of apprenticeship, and there are marker points in the transition from an intern to a developer to a senior developer and so on. Yeah. However, if you look at our profession at large, nah. So I seem to be stalked on the internet, yeah, by these two on the right, especially the fellow at the bottom who seems to follow me around going, have you heard of Thing? Thing is where it's at. You should do this online course in Thing. So we're all familiar with coding academies and online programs and all this kind of thing, where they take people out of university, train them up quickly, and then launch them into the industry. Or they take people from different backgrounds and launch them into the industry. We're all well familiar with this. Yeah, some of them extremely reputable, do an amazing job. So some of them not so much. And you can, of course, find people complaining about this on Twitter. So it's really useful being active on Twitter because you can always find something relevant to your talk. So as I was putting this talk together, this tweet came through the timeline, and this is exactly the kind of thing that we're talking about. So we have to mark down on that one as well. Then do we belong to a guild or union? Well, there is the British Computer Society, okay? And this is how I always imagine them on the right-hand side. So whenever I graduated 20 plus years ago, I was recommended to join the BCS by one of my lecturers. And for a while, they sent me some membership mails, but that was about it. Okay, so I've never heard the BCS discussed as anything that was essential or really valuable or something you should definitely do. So it's like, I'm sure they're wonderful people doing an amazing job, but they're definitely not like a keystone of our industry. You definitely don't have to belong to them in order to make progress or be accredited or get published or whatever it happens to be. And then finally, follow a code of conduct. Yeah, so I think we can answer that for ourselves, So I always give the example of a former colleague who has more lines of code, more NPM dependencies, yeah, than they have lines of code on the server side, yeah. So that's something to think about, So whenever you have more lines of code and more NPM dependencies than you have lines of code on the server side, that's a little bit worrying, So as an industry, we're doing great things, but I'm not aware of us following any formal codes of conduct, okay? So not doing that well, folks, so we've been marked down on all of these. Yeah. But then stage 3, does it actually matter at the end of the day? Okay. So let's answer this in 4 ways. Is professionalism a good thing? Well, yes, professionalism is what you would want in your psychiatrist. You wouldn't want them sharing, your innermost secrets on social media just for upvotes and so on. Yeah. So professionalism can be a good thing. But not always. Yeah. So back in the day, the idea of a professional army or a professional police force used to completely freak people out. So if you go back to the formation of the police in London, you can find that there was a huge amount of resistance to this, and it was regarded as a terrible imposition and a terrible thing against the civil rights of the citizenry, to have a bunch of people wandering around able to give you orders and potentially hit you with clubs. So this was fiercely resisted back in the day. Also, the idea of professional politicians. This is something that doesn't necessarily sit easy with everyone. The idea that your profession is to be a politician. So you haven't entered politics out of individual conviction after a long career doing some other things and learning about life and so on. No, you're just there to be a politician. So that does tend to freak people out. And I have a few good friends who work in the charities sector and do amazing jobs attracting funding to good causes and managing things professionally and so on. But again, the idea that there is a separate charities industry and that you can work in the charities sector as a professional, for your entire career, again, that grates a little bit. Should there be a charities sector? Should this be a thing in its own right? So maybe yes, maybe no. So then, does professionalism equal competence? Well, in the case of architects and tree surgeons, we hope yes. I very much hope so, because my neighbor actually has tree surgeons in at the moment. You may have heard the noise. So it's not impossible that a large tree could come crashing through the ceiling at some point during this talk. So I really, really hope the tree surgeon next door does have professional competence. Yeah. But you do not have to be a professional to have competence. So for example, if we consider sports coaches, so my kids get coaching from some coaches who have like Olympic level competence. They are incredibly good at what they do. But the salary and the respect that they receive is meager compared to their talents. So they have an amazing degree of competence, yet they are not regarded as professionals. And the other sphere in which I'm active as a martial arts instructor, again, it's the Mr. Miyagi syndrome. So you find incredibly competent people who are being paid tiny amounts of money for the skill that they're passing on. So it's almost true to say that any rich martial artist is a fraud, if they're not a movie star. So if somebody is just a regular martial arts instructor and they're earning huge amounts of money, they've probably sold out, in some way. And there are certain things that we just don't want to think about as being competencies, like rhetoric. So again, this takes us back a little bit to the idea of professional politicians, the idea that there is an actual skill set involved in persuading you of things. The idea that there's this toolkit, and if you learn this toolkit, you can persuade anybody of anything, regardless of whether the subject is right or wrong or true or false. Again, that doesn't necessarily sit well with people. And then, does professionalism bring success? No. Okay. So some really good talks you might like to listen to. This one from GoTo by Stephen Carver, who lays out what led up to the space shuttle disasters and how, although you had all of these professional engineers doing the best they possibly could, terrible things still went wrong, because of the larger political and social context of what was going on. Yeah. Or the recent crashes, with the Boeing 737, if you're familiar with the wider story there. Yeah. So professionalism doesn't necessarily bring success. Yeah. And, relating it back to the IT sector, if you worked in lasers or magnets or anything like that, you had the dot-com boom. So the dot-com boom for you was whenever Ronald Reagan was president and had launched the Star Wars program. And there was billions and billions of dollars of research money being put into creating magnetic rail guns and lasers that could shoot down incoming missiles and all this kind of thing. So if you want to know more about that, there's an amazing book called the New Maginot Line, yeah, which really goes into to all of this in detail, yeah. And again, billions of dollars spent, virtually nothing produced, yeah. And we've had a few local stories of our own, you know, that you will be aware of, yeah? And we're definitely getting that bridge to Scotland, yeah. So professionalism doesn't necessarily bring success, yeah. Does professionalism encourage growth? No, and often the reverse, okay? So this show is a little bit old now, so you might not have seen it, but if you haven't seen Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, I cannot recommend it enough. It's one of the best things the BBC ever put out. And in the show, you had the minister / prime minister who was constantly being frustrated by the civil service, you know, and this is one of the famous quotes here. So the civil service, and in particular the Foreign Office, you know, was not there to do things. It was to explain why things could not be done. Yeah. So some professions seem to be there to impede growth. Yeah. And regardless of your political views, this is an incredibly hot topic at the moment. So as we know, the Prime Minister's senior advisor is a fellow called Dominic Cummings, and he has it as a goal, yeah, to try and break down some of the established structures in the civil service, to such an extent that he published this job ad calling for super talented weirdos, wild cards, and unusual mathematicians. Okay, so what we're seeing there is the deliberate attempt, yeah, to use amateurism, yeah, to displace professionalism, because the professionalism is seen as impeding growth, you know. So sometimes professionalism just leads to a private members club, you know, where the profession is there to protect the interest of the people in the profession. So some great examples of this from science. If you're familiar with Bill Bryson, A Short History of Nearly Everything, amazing book. So one of the stories in there was how plate tectonics was actually invented by 3 amateurs, or rather 3 scientists who were not involved in geology in any way. And because within geology, the idea that the continents could move around had been a taboo, you know, even suggesting it got you ridiculed for centuries, well, a century. So that they came in and were able to shake things up and prove how the tectonic plates were actually moving around. Yeah. And this is a talk I always use when people try and disparage philosophy. So one of the things that philosophy is interested in is consciousness. Yeah. And the reason that they're interested in consciousness is because the medical profession aren't allowed to get interested in it. So great talk by John Searle, very famous philosopher, who went out and tried to work with neurologists, and he got some pushback because the neurologist said, look, it's only okay to be interested in consciousness if you've got tenure first, you know, get tenure first. Yeah. So one of the things that makes a profession is that you say, look, there are certain things that we don't do. There are certain things that are not part of our profession. There are certain things that we are not interested in. And that can be a huge impediment to growth. So in the case of neurology, it was only whenever brain scans got good enough that they could actually start talking about consciousness as a real and interesting topic. But the philosophers were there centuries before. And one final one, if you're familiar with the book Freakonomics, again, an absolutely amazing read, how an economist went out and just applied his skills to various, you know, areas of human endeavor where he would be a rank amateur. So one example was sumo. You know, he just looked at the results from sumo matches, and he was able to prove that in a match where if one of the participants lost the match, they would drop, you know, a whole layer in ranking. Well, their opponent would let them win. And there was a whole a quid pro quo system based around that. Yeah. And he was able to do that without ever going to a sumo match, just by looking at the results. So professionalism doesn't necessarily encourage growth. Yeah. And in fact, the more educated you are, the less likely you are to take risks. You know, so you can get studies done by people like the Harvard Business Review to prove that the people who make it to CEO first, they aren't necessarily the most educated, because the most educated have a safe path. You know, so if you're a highly qualified engineer and you're with an established firm, you know, you're going to end up wealthy, you're going to end up with respect intellect and so on, there's a 1 in 10 chance if you form your own company that you might end up a millionaire or a billionaire. Do you really want to take that chance? So again, you know, sufficient professionalism can be a disincentive to growth. So to make some conclusions, you know, are we a profession? My personal answer, meh. You know, it seems to matter an awful lot to certain people. You know, it certainly mattered to the people that I discussed this talk with. Yeah, but at the moment, I don't think it really matters. And why? Well, a great quote from the Discworld books. Yeah, alloys are stronger. You know, at the end of the day, software engineering benefits massively from having people coming into it from all kinds of different areas. Okay, so the one thing that we can boast in software engineering is academic diversity. Sadly, we cannot boast other kinds of diversity, and that's a terrible thing that needs to be improved. Yeah, but we do have academic diversity. You know, so we benefit from having engineers and physicists like Kevlin coming into the industry, linguists and psychologists, musicians and economists and so on. You know, these are all people who have come into the industry, and we benefit, yeah, from their perspectives. So musicians, you know, I've taught a pile of musicians to program, and you find that they take to it very, very easily. So you know, if you've spent 3 or 4 years doing classical composition, well, then I know that the structure of a computer program isn't going to freak you out, you know, and the same thing with linguists and so on. And maybe as a profession, we're still going through the Gartner hype cycle. So you know the way whenever a new technology comes along, it gets praised and it's the software industry's solution to everything. And then we realize it's not all it was set up to be. So it's a disaster and it's terrible. And then we have the slope of enlightenment and we end up on the plateau of productivity, you know. So maybe as a profession, we're still riding the roller coaster. You know, we still haven't found out where our place is in wider society, what we're good at and bad at and so on. So we're not quite ready to be a profession yet. And that isn't a bad thing, yeah, because we're still in this madly productive stage of huge creativity, okay? So a little pop quiz, name the languages, apart from the last one, based on their logo, okay? So these are the languages I do not know yet, yeah, but I know I need to learn, you know? So it's on my list of things to do, to learn these languages over the next year or so, because one of these is highly likely to be, well, not the complete future, but a very large part of the future, you know. So we, as a profession, we still haven't decided on what the right languages are yet, you know. So we're still in this madly productive stage. And yes, ethics matter. Ethics absolutely matters, yeah, but you don't have to be in a profession to have ethics, you know. And I would argue that at the moment, ethics matter to all of us, you know. We're all making real ethical decisions at the moment. For example, whether or not you're currently wearing a mask when you go to the shops and so on. Wear a mask, by the way. Yeah? So you do not have to be in a profession to be a person of honor. Okay, so really nice quote here from a few good men, you know. So of course stated there in a military context, but it applies to all of us. Okay, so you don't have to belong to a rigidly well-defined profession in order to have a code of ethics, yeah, or to be acting in an ethical way. So in summary, if you're familiar with the sketch, I'm not a professional and I'm okay. Yeah. And yes, at the moment I am working all night and sleeping all day, and that's not a healthy thing, but there you go. So at the end of the day, I don't believe we are a profession. Yeah, but I'm perfectly okay with that. And I think there's a strong argument to be made for that being a good thing. Okay. Grant. So we seem to have gone massively over time. Apologies for that. If you did drop out and you're catching back up on the recording, thank you very much for doing that. But I think at this stage, we'll call a halt and leave it here. Okay. So thank you so much to all of our contributors. Thank you so much to you guys for attending. And we very much hope to see you on the August bash. So thank you very much.